So, I'd like to tell you about materialist feminism because it provides the intellectual and political context to Monique Wittig's thought and some of the texts you will read for today, especially as the ways in which these thinkers engage with questions of power, subjections, and freedom. So, while political action inaugurated materialist feminist work and materialist feminists thought of themselves as radical feminists, these materialist feminists sought to bring about, in the works of Monique Wittig, an epistemological revolution. That is, they offered an analysis of the operations of patriarchy, sex, and race and class in radical and new ways. And in fact, for them, knowledge could best denaturalize the world around them. So to do so, they founded a political and academic journal that they named Questions Féministes, Feminist Questions, in 1977. And they asked Beauvoir to become its chief editor. Now, in practice, Beauvoir only lent her name, but here she signaled her commitment and the journal's orientation. Now, of these thinkers, I'm going to talk about the most well-known. So one of those was Christine Delphi. Now, like Beauvoir, Christine Delphi was critical of Marxist historical materialism, and instead she sought to reinvent it. For her, a feminist analysis required taking seriously the materiality of ideology, as she named it, while subverting the common sense of Marxist politics. Now, because, she argued, Marxism saw class as a fundamental category of alienation, the working class remained an ungendered category. However, for Delphi, capitalism and patriarchy were imbricated systems of domination. So, in fact, she called for a focus on the ideological and material conditions and operations of patriarchy, understood to be an autonomous system of exploitation and domination of women by men. So, beginning from the principles that, and I quote, the ways in which life is materially produced and reproduced is the basis for all organization of all societies, Delphi argued that the family was not private, nor was it a natural social form, but it was an economic system which participated in the relations of production. In fact, Friedrich Engels had said as much. But she insisted the sexual division of labor was certainly not a natural fact that was later appropriated by capitalism. In fact, the domestic division of labor, namely the family, was central to capitalism. Now, as I've said before, these feminist materialism were in part inspired and in conversation with feminists elsewhere, notably American feminists. So Delphi had spent a year at UC Berkeley, and she had worked within the civil rights movement. Wittig was in conversation with American feminists, and Guillaumin turned to American sociology in the service of her own thinking. So in many of these writings, as was the case in the 18th century, slavery was the most commonly cited comparison, historical antecedent, and metaphor that these thinkers involved. But it wasn't mere analogy for them. For these feminists, analyzing patriarchy, capitalism, and oppression was made possible by thinking about the ways in which the social facts of sex and race were naturalized and ideologically organized. Now, the idea of race especially structured Colette Guillaumin's thinking about the work of difference on bodies and the ideological effects of subordination upon individuals. And she, in fact, expanded Delphi's analysis. So moving beyond Beauvoir's analogy between, I quote, women, blacks, and Jews, Guillaumin analyzed how these categories of meaning were made and structured the social. As she explained, and I quote, the invention of the idea of nature cannot be separated from domination and the appropriation of human beings. So for her, it was important not to separate out the mental and the material forms the operations of power took. Now, in fact, she argued that it was racism that produced the category of race, which was then essentialized and naturalized, just as sex and gender were. And she wrote, and I quote, colonization by appropriation of people, traffic in slaves, later in laborers, and territories was identical to the appropriation of the bodies of women. And she coined a new word to explain this system called sexage, where she took the word sex with the French word for slavery and for serfdom. And in fact, this was her attempt at capturing this historical system of appropriation of women's bodies. Now, Guillomin was not alone in denaturalizing the categories of sex and race and how they marked bodies. Nicole Clos-Mathieu also did so. She worked at the intersection of anthropology and sociology, and she believed, like Guillomin, that embodiment is always political. So she offered an equally rigorous analysis of the way sex structured social relations and organized women into an essentialized class of subordinated individuals. And here she turned to Hegel and Marcel Mauss to think about how the social shaped consciousness and the self. So, like Beauvoir before her, she argued this was a relational situation. So the invisibility of male social actors depended upon the invisibility of women as social actors, now revealing that women were imagined as a gendered class of individuals only in relation to another, men, required that gender relations be understood for what they were, namely a relationship of domination and subordination. And she was especially interested in the ways in which those who belong to an oppressed group negotiate the constraints and even come to embody the paradoxical injunctions they're subjected to. And she explained in a slogan that became a very famous feminist slogan that to surrender is not to consent. So to surrender to oppression is not to consent to oppression, and this was important. It also kept open the possibility of thinking about forms of resistance. Now, Guillomin, Mathieu, and Delphi all believed that a revolution was needed and that this was necessary. And in fact, Delphi wrote, to construct another future, we obviously need an analysis of the present. But in fact, she added, we need one that is a utopian vision, that is, that dares to imagine that things can be different. So indeed, true revolution involved and required imagination and reinvention. And Monique Wittig called for such a feminist revolution. In fact, she first came to prominence not as an activist, but in 1964 as a writer, when her first novel, L'Opoponax, was given this literary prize, very prestigious one, for recognition of the ways in which she reinvented writing. In 1967, she was asked to translate Herbert Marcuse's critique of the forms of social repression that characterize both capitalism and communism. It was published in French in 1968 as The One-Dimensional Man. And it really also shaped Wittig's thought. Now, like Delphi, Wittig believed that Marxism had failed as a political theory of emancipation. She too was a member of the Feminist Questions collective, and they had failed because it refused to consider and recognize the specificity of women's oppression. She was also critical of psychoanalysis and of the ways in which it claimed the unconscious structured language, though she did note that, in fact, it was the thought of domination that kept women enslaved, and that was so naturalized that it prevented even questioning it. So for Wittig, the aim was not just to reimagine sexual difference. She wanted to undo the ways sex, gender, and sexuality function as political regimes ordering the world and individuals within it. And this is what we'll read and discuss this week. So for her, more was needed than just undoing the myth of woman, as Beauvoir had done. Revolution meant interrogating the very ways language produced sex and naturalized difference and oppression. Language, she wrote, bore the mark of gender. And this diagnosis was fundamental to her work, and in fact, it was central to what she wanted to do. That is, as she said, to destroy the categories of sex in thought, politics, and language. Because, and I quote, language casts sheaves of reality upon the social body, stamping it and violently shaping it. So remaking the social body required the reinvention of language, as she did in her fiction. However, Wittig's embrace of a lesbian feminist materialist position met with a lot of resistance on the part of MLF feminists who could not really undo the system of heterosexuality. And against these political attacks, she decided to leave France and left in the late 70s for the United States with her lover and partner, Sandy Saig, who was an American choreographer. She got a job at the University of Arizona in French and Women's Studies, where she stayed until her death in 2003. And by the time she reached the 1990s and just before her death, what consumed her own energies was, in fact, no longer feminist materialism, but Chicana feminisms, and the ways in which the thought of Gloria Anzaldúa and Sherry Moraga had reinvented the meaning of feminism, so that she moved from Paris to the borderlands, still thinking through the question of bodies, language, and sex.